Thank you very much for having me here today, and I very much appreciate the opportunity which AusIMM has given me to speak. And I think, in fact, I'm going to speak, I think, directly connected to the theme of the conference about education. Yesterday, I opened the Australian Financial Review to see these four headlines: Ferguson to attend oil talks in Jeddah. Alan Carpenter's plea for his state to use less gas in the light of interruption to gas supplies. An article, believe it or not, jointly authored by the President of the Australian Council of Trade Unions and the Chief Executive of the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry about a united front to climate change, and a reprint of an article in The Economist, challenged to being green but not being mean, about the impact of climate change on poorer people. Yesterday wasn't an unusual day for the Australian Financial Review or for other newspapers. And these stories reflect the fact that energy issues and climate change are key issues of the day here in Australia and elsewhere as well. Our own polling research, and everybody else's for that matter, shows that over 90% of people think that climate change is a problem and they want their governments to do something about it. What is to be done is, in fact, rapidly becoming a strongly debated issue in the contest of ideas that is Australian policy making. At the broadest level, there is a contest emerging between those who argue for economic growth as a response to climate change, and that's my view, and those who argue for economic contraction. More narrowly, there is a continuing series of debates about the details of an emissions trading scheme, about the future of various schemes for technology support, and about the role of renewables compared to fossil fuels and their potential clean development trajectories. An energy supply industry like ours will need to be and want to be engaged by all those debates. And of course, we will continue to prosecute the case for our industry on economic and climate change grounds. As we do so, we have to continue to assure our stakeholders that we are committed to safe and responsible management of our operations and of our product and perform accordingly. But the broader and narrower issues in the contest of ideas require some basic facts. That's why the Australian Uranium Association commissioned Deloitte to investigate those questions for us, and that is largely what I want to talk about today. Jim has already touched upon this issue, so I won't be too lengthy on it. The expansion of Australia's uranium industry is a classic case of the global economy at work. The economic history of the world, especially since the 18th century, is a long and continuing story of changing patterns of demand in response to rising prosperity and modernising technology. One of the key factors underpinning this growth and change is energy supply. We can see this clearly today in Asia as economic growth and liberalisation generate rising expectations, consumerism and choice, especially in China and India, but elsewhere, which is also increasing demand for energy. And who would deny a manufacturing worker in Shanghai or a smart IT guy in Mumbai the opportunity to live a better, more prosperous life? Well, some would, but I'll come back to that. In the 21st century, there are additional and complicating factors in play: the quest for energy security and the challenge of climate change. And we can see many examples of this, many examples of this concern about energy security, including right here in Australia. And the interruption to gas supplies in Western Australia is a classic example, as I think is the debate over the privatisation of energy sources or electricity generation in New South Wales. And climate change, it's hard to overestimate the importance of that issue today. It's likely that the magnitude of the economic adjustments required and their costs are not well understood. And I think that's what's being signalled by Professor Garneau here in Australia as he develops the core of an emissions trading scheme, and it's also been recently signalled by Sir Nicholas Stern. The revised outlook is increasingly challenging, but as Jim has pointed out, Jim has pointed out, all the drivers are pointing to a need for alternatives to fossil fuels. And as Jim has also pointed out, nuclear is right in there because of its low emissions over the life cycle, the fact that it's continuous and available right now, and because of its technology and cost advantages. It's not the complete answer. There is a role for renewables, and here in Australia we would be foolish if we didn't make a bet on the development of clean coal technology. But of course you know all that. But many don't, which is another reason why we commissioned Deloitte to examine the climate change context in which the Australian uranium industry would be operating for the reasonably foreseeable future. Again, I won't dwell on this, but this shows the Australia's primary supply of world uranium compared to its reasonably assured resources. We have about half the primary supply compared to what our resources are. And that's an indication of the gap. That gap is an indication of Australia's opportunity. Jim has also shown a similar slide to this. What this shows is that over 30 reactors are currently being built in the world, 94 are being planned, and there are another 220 proposed. So against that background, we asked Deloitte to construct a couple of scenarios for us and to model the scenarios. In fact, we modelled 2 scenarios for climate change and matched them with 2 possible Australian uranium policy scenarios. The 2 climate change scenarios are called climate action and climate crisis. Climate action involves stabilisation of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere at 550 parts per million by 2050, and climate crisis involves stabilisation at 450 parts per million. These are in fact essentially the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's scenarios. Climate action is based on there being 960 reactors by 2030. And while my discussion today, in fact, will focus on the climate action scenario, which we think is both conservative and more likely than the climate crisis one, the climate crisis scenario is not implausible. Climate action gives rise to demand for uranium of about 150,000 tonnes of uranium oxide in 2030, which looks achievable. And I should mention here that the latest edition of the International Atomic Energy Agency's Red Book documents about 12 million tonnes in all of the cost categories. And of course I'll be very interested in what Robert Vance and Ian Lambert will be saying on this subject tomorrow. The Australian policy scenarios envisage the extension of uranium mining into Western Australia and Queensland on the one hand, or not on the other, as the case may be. The modelling was undertaken by the Centre for Policy Studies at Monash University, utilising a model of the Australian economy that Professor Garneau is also using in his modelling. And of course, we wanted some robust scenarios, those which could be justified and made sense. So we did a lot of work to test the reality of those scenarios. Deloitte undertook a literature review of the projections of demand for nuclear power generation and the assumptions underpinning those global projections. They looked at a range of forecasts, including these. The literature review showed that typically forecasts for demand for nuclear power have been built from the bottom up on the basis of commitments to the expansion of nuclear power generation. The exception is the 4th assessment of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which considered the impact of a US $50 per tonne carbon price on the global nuclear power industry. The table you're looking at shows the results of the review and indicates that the bottom-up analyses do not specifically or systematically take into account the impact of multilateral climate change policies or factor in a carbon price. These bottom-up analyses are built on the basis of industry or country intelligence. There's nothing wrong with that approach. It does what it does. The scenario-building approach, which is what Deloitte undertook, is also a useful method used widely by economists for estimating the outcome of changes in key economic variables. The conservative growth path for global demand in nuclear power in the research, which is what I will shortly talk about, is based, as I said, on the IPCC's mid-range forecast for nuclear power growth, which would see total nuclear power generation grow to 960 megawatts by 2030. The US $50 carbon price scenario also represents the IPCC's mid-case scenario for future carbon prices. We believe this, in fact, is a conservative scenario, which also represents the low-end rate of change for climate change policy. The scenario posits that the increase in demand for uranium for nuclear power will support a conservative long-run average contract price for uranium of $100 per pound of U3O8. And given a current contract price of around $90 per pound and increased demand, a projected price of $100 is both possible and conservative. Deloitte also undertook a series of stakeholder consultations to test these possible assumptions about the future of the Australian industry under the range of demand projections. One of the things we wanted to know was the capacity of the Australian industry to meet the supply potential that the demand side scenarios were leading to. We were encouraged by these consultations, and there's one lesson from those which I will talk about later. We were also bolstered in the conclusion that Australia could meet the supply requirements by data like these. On the basis of these and other data, we were able to conclude that no new discoveries of uranium in Australia would be required to support the industry's growth under the conservative climate action scenario. So we're confident that Australia can mine and export the uranium quantities projected in the climate action scenario. That confidence is also justified by this chart, which shows the projections for demand in the climate action scenario, and you can see the arrow pointing to that, compared to the Switkowski's report long-term demand forecast and the IPCC's demand projections. Our demand pathway is clearly in the same ballpark as Switkowski and the IPCC. Again, very conservative. And finally, the rapid growth of Australia's uranium exploration activity provides further support for these projections. You can see from this chart that expenditure on exploration in Australia was around about $10 million in 2003-2004. By 2006-2007, it had risen to something over $114 million. And in the first half of 2007-2008, that is for the 6 months ending in December 2007, the amount of exploration expenditure was about $120 million and had already exceeded the exploration expenditure for the whole of 2006-2007. So if exploration investment is an indication of both the confidence, but also then we believe that again our projections are very, 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 very conservative and achievable. The first scenario, climate action, in which Australian uranium exports expand threefold or fourfold to 28,000 tonnes up to 37,000 tonnes by 2030, is the scenario for moderate growth and the more likely one. I should say, however, that views about the challenge of climate change are evolving rapidly, and growth in nuclear power of the dimensions of the second, more aggressive scenario could not be ruled out, even though it looks less likely. Climate action would see Australian GDP in net present value terms to 2030 increase by between $14 billion and $17 billion, and consumption by between $12 billion and $15 billion, depending upon the extent of state government support for expansion. In the scenario where the world's governments more aggressively rein in greenhouse emissions, Australia's GDP would be nearly $27 billion to about $32 billion higher, and consumption $23 to $28 billion higher, again depending upon state government policies. While these are impressive figures, Australia's uranium industry will continue to be a middle-ranking export industry. There's nothing wrong with that, because Australia's prosperity depends partly on middle-ranking export industries, especially those that can make the most of their comparative advantage as patterns of global demand change. Bear in mind that change may also mean decline in some exports, which increases the importance of export expansion in products of which the world wants more. And just to focus for a moment on those states which do not currently permit uranium mining, under the climate action scenario, mining in those states will contribute $3.2 billion to Australian GDP and $3 billion to consumption. And by participating in that export expansion opportunity, both states are also considerably better off than if they did not participate. Western Australia by $3.2 billion and Queensland by $1.5 billion. The economic benefits that expansion can bring carry with them the obligation on our industry to perform to the expectations of our stakeholders. Economic benefit alone will not make the case for our stakeholders, make the case that our stakeholders will be able to embrace. They will want to be assured that we behave safely and responsibly as an industry. As an industry, we have recently taken a large step forward by finalising an industry charter and a code of practice, and by agreeing principles of uranium stewardship. The new chairman of the Australian Uranium Association, Graham Hunt, will launch those policies tomorrow. Any energy supplier today is acutely conscious of its contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. So are we, not least because that consciousness has to be part of our commitment to the safe and responsible management of our product. And as it happens, we believe there's also a good story to tell about uranium, and so we also asked Deloitte to estimate the impact of global greenhouse gas emissions of the expansion of Australia's uranium industry. And just to refresh your memory on why that matters, I have 4 slides to show, all of which concern life cycle emissions of nuclear power. And Jim, you stole my thunder a bit. I'm going to use one of the ones you used, but I've got 3 others. And I'm showing you 4 just to emphasise the point that there's not much dispute about this. This first one was done by the Centre for Integrated Sustainability Analysis at the University of Sydney and done for the Switkowski inquiry. And again, it shows you the place of nuclear in the league table of greenhouse gas intensity. The second one, by the World Energy Council, shows a very similar result. A third, and this is the one that Jim used from the University of Wisconsin, again shows a very similar result. And finally, a chart based on work done by the OECD and the Nuclear Energy Agency. I show you 4 charts. I think it's indisputable that nuclear power has very, very low greenhouse gas intensity, even compared to those favourite renewables. So what did that? We then went on to estimate the greenhouse gas abatement potential of Australian uranium exports. What would happen if we increase our uranium exports to their potential? And even under the more moderate climate action scenario, Australia's uranium exports would avoid between 11 billion and 15 billion tonnes of greenhouse gas emissions to 2030. And under the more aggressive climate crisis scenario, 19 to 23 billion tonnes. At a minimum, the exports of Australian uranium in 2030 alone would avoid 10 times the emissions abatement required to meet Australia's Kyoto target in 2010. Or put another way, the emissions avoided globally to 2030 from our exports are equivalent to Australia being carbon-free for 15 to 20 years. Or put another way, about double the Australia's annual average emissions in the years 2008 to 2012. And by way of further comparison, the greenhouse emissions that the federal government says will be avoided by its mandatory renewable energy target is 342 million tonnes from 2010 to 2030. about a third of what would be avoided by our exports to the world in 2030 alone. It is not far off the mark to say that expanding our exports to their potential is the single largest contribution that Australia could make to global greenhouse gas mitigation. These data fully support the position we have put to Professor Garneau that the expansion of our industry to its potential will have global greenhouse gas abatement benefits, contributions beyond that which could be made by Australian domestic climate change policy alone. Our exports can help offset the costs of structural adjustment to climate change in Australia and increase the flexibility and options available globally to address the greenhouse challenge. It will help avoid the low road path of economic contraction that some are advocating as the way to manage climate change. One of the learnings from this research is that it is only just becoming understood how profound will be the impact of climate change policies on the global economy. This was particularly evident in the consultation phase of the research. The interviews Deloitte's conducted led many of the interviewees to concentrate for the first time on the potential impact and on the opportunities it presented to the Australian uranium industry. This leads to another thought. If we had built our scenarios on different assumptions, such as a carbon price a bit lower or a bit higher, or a long-term contract price a bit lower or a bit higher, or demand for nuclear power that was a bit lower or a bit higher, it would not have made much difference to the economic outcomes. Our industry would still have been a middle-ranking industry, and the argument for its expansion as a response to changing patterns of global demand would have been the same. And of course, our uranium endowment would have been no less. We still would not have had to discover any more uranium to make a major to continue as a major supplier, and we could still make a major contribution to climate change. Which gets me to the next point. Worries about climate change are giving voice to the idea that the world must reduce its prosperity and growth in order to stabilise greenhouse gas emissions. Shrinking the world's economy will not save us from climate change. It will make the management of climate change harder to achieve and discourage the growing Asian economies from wanting to have a part in that challenge. Some of those in the contractionary camp say we'll have to look back to the 60s and before for our economic and lifestyle models and aspirations. Of course, without the need for either coal-fired electricity with carbon capture and storage or for nuclear power. Embedded in the beliefs of the contractionary camp is the belief that the world must grow poorer in order to address climate change. We will have to respond to these ideas with a more compelling idea, not just because the idea of economic contraction is a bad one, but because it will lead to a series of poor policy decisions across the board. Economic growth is not the enemy of climate change, it is the key to managing climate change. Economic growth is essential to creating a broad consensus for action, and the wealth that growth generates is the means to take that action. A rich China is much more likely to engage than a poor one, and much more able to take action. For Australia, the outplaying of this idea means identifying how we can develop our domestic energy endowment in ways that are consistent with both growth and managing climate change. In practical terms, it will mean finding ways to encourage the development of renewables and clean coal technologies, and of course the expansion of Australia's uranium exports. An energy-rich nation like Australia, with resources like uranium that far exceed our own needs, has a privileged role in supplying these resources to nations that can use them, and in using them, greatly reduce the world's carbon burden. Countries like China and a little further down the track, Indonesia, Thailand and Vietnam, see nuclear power as part of their solution for securing their energy and growing their economies. We will need to consider how we can help meet those needs, especially when Australia sets and reinforces some of the toughest anti-proliferation measures of any uranium exporting nation. and when our uranium exports make such a significant contribution to the global fight against climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. Each nation must contribute to the climate change struggle in the most effective way it can, and supplying uranium is one enormously significant contribution Australia can make to the global effort. We can do so while making a significant contribution to Australia's economic well-being, using the comparative advantage of our uranium endowment and our competitive advantage as a stable nation and reliable supplier. Thank you very much.
Any questions for Michael?
In the role of what we can play with uranium, but of course it's one state and the Northern Territory. What does your lobby see as a perception as to when perhaps Western Australia and Queensland could change their ways? For instance, the suggestion at one earlier conference was that it may happen in Western Australia if Alan Carpenter was hit by a bus.
I wouldn't like to see any Premier of Australian state get hit by a bus. Look, it seems to me that the pathway through that difficult area is not particularly clear. I suspect that the most likely cause for a change in policy will be as a result of countries which are customers of our resource-producing states drawing attention to the ambiguity which exists in Australian uranium policy and wondering why that is. I think that's probably the most likely way in which there will be a change in policy, that it will come from Australia's customers indicating that they find the policy ambiguous and wondering why Australia is preventing them from growing their economies and shifting from poverty to prosperity by way of using the energy which is available and which Australia can supply. But look, I think it's a difficult task, and I'm not sure I know the answer. But look, it might be like that.
Michael, in both yours and Jim's presentation, you showed quite a substantial increase of installed nuclear capacity in India. Where is that uranium going to come from?
Well, under the current policy, it won't be coming from Australia. I think that's pretty clear. But there are other countries which produce uranium, and I think one of the things which Jim pointed out is that we have a very large competitor in Kazakhstan, and maybe that's where it comes from. But all I can say at the moment is it certainly won't be coming from Australia.